Sawadee-ka. A quick note, this room is for the TIJ IGLP workshop for emerging leaders, so if you're in the wrong room, now's the time. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Saramon Ploy Urapi Patanapong, and I have the honor of serving as your Master of Ceremonies for today's proceedings. First and foremost, please allow me to welcome you to the opening plenary of the TIJ IGLP workshop for emerging leaders on the rule of law and policy. We have a full day ahead of us, so I hope you've all come prepared for all the interesting sessions we have planned for you. To begin with, we will be hearing from Professor Kittipong Kittiarak, Executive Director of the Thailand Institute of Justice. With a career spanning over 3 decades, he has been a longtime advocate and active reformer of Thailand's criminal justice system. He has served as a public prosecutor and as permanent secretary of the Ministry of Justice. Since then, he has led the Thailand Institute of Justice to become the first United Nations Program Network Institute in the ASEAN region. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Kittipong Kittiarak.
Thank you, Proy. Welcome again. I've been assigned to give introductory statement with this note in hoping that after you have heard what I said, what I will say, you'll be convinced why you have to sacrifice your Christmas and New Year vacation reading all the materials that have been assigned to you. First question that I would like to ask is, how many lawyers in this room? So for those of you who are non-lawyers, you will see that you are the majority, right? And then come the questions, why are you non-lawyers were here, right? I think you have to ask yourself so many times, what do we have to do with this rule of law, right? You hear about my background that I've been lawyers all my life as teaching law, also working as a prosecutors, policy makers. And then I realized that without participation from outside, from those who are non-lawyers, maybe it's very difficult to change things. For somehow, I don't know about your countries, but in Thailand, people think that law is for lawyers. It's a technical things that lawyers only have the expertise to do it, to change the law, to implement the law. But the fact is, at least from my experience, I've been involved in the reform process all my life, and personally I think we're back to square one. And if I look back from my experience, I think maybe the prior reform, we spent too much time debating on the definition of the law and the rule of law. Probably we need more political will to tackle this very difficult problem, and maybe without multi-stakeholder participation in this process, maybe it's very difficult to try to shape the law to become a tools where you can make important policy happen. So without a good law, even though you have a good policy, how can you implement effectively that policy? When I say laws, I mean all the regulations on the bureaucratic system which run by regulation. So I think law has a lot to do with the implementation of a policy. And also law has a lot to do with the good policy itself. Because a good law should be the one that could distribute the wealth equitably, equally, and justly. So I think when we're talking about development, if we want a sustained, equitable, and inclusive development, we need to have a good law and a good rule of law for the implementation of it. I have these ideas, I think, all my life, trying to ponder what could we do better to try to improve the rule of law and make it a tool for good policy implementation. And I am unable to convince anyone that this is the way to go, because the majority is the lawyers who probably, I don't know in other countries, but it's very difficult here to talk about legal stuff with non-lawyers. But very fortunately, that you will hear later from my very good friend, that the so-called SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goal, happen to somehow share my belief that if you need a sustainable, it means that equitable, just, and sustained, inclusive development, you would need the rule of law. So come the goal 16 that focus on at least one target in this 169, I'm not sure, is that 169 target? One target is the importance of the rule of law. And personally, I believe that it's not only one target, but it's the foundation of everything. So I think I hope to be able to convince you a little bit from the start that you have a lot to do with it, even though you are not a lawyer, to come here. And I have to personally thank everyone that, like David, my good friend, mentioned, that you believe in us, and you spend your time trying to read this very complex arrangement and all the assignment during the whole 1 month or less that you have spent time, and with the belief that this would mean something to your career. And we hope make what you do better, as David say. For lawyers, we hope to be able to convince you that you have to probably spend times in the other people's shoes to understand what the policy is like and how to make the law as a tool for implementation of it. For the non-lawyers, you have to be able, you have to convince that the rule of law is not only for lawyers. Maybe something is too important to left in the hand of anyone or any groups alone. That what I would like to say. And today I think you have a great opportunity to explore the issues. You will hear about the rule of law from the United Nations framework from my good friend, Mr. Nicholas Booth, who is the program advisor for governance, conflict prevention, access to justice, and human rights at the United Nations Development Program. Later this afternoon, you will hear from my colleagues, Ms. Chontit Chunura, Chief of the Implementation of the Bangkok Rules and Treatment of Offenders Program at the TIJ. Bangkok Rule is the UN United Nations standard and norm for women prisoners that have gender perspective in it. You will hear from her about the pathway why so many women were detained, and what do we got to do with this problem that is not only for those in the criminal justice that need to tackle with. So I am sure that today and the next 6 days you will have a lot to share with your friends. I would like to emphasize again that the lecturer, the facilitator, is just to want to try to coach you to expose to the issues. What most important for this program is the learning from your peers. You should spend time talking to your friends. I have I'm the only one who go through all your files, and I've been very impressed with what you've done. Every one of you, really. You've been achieving so much in your field, and I think if you have time to talk with one another and learn what all you guys are doing, you will be very impressed. And I hope that the friendship, the networking, the partnership will continue even after this workshop. So without further ado, I would like to ask you to please help me welcome Mr. Nicholas Booth onto the stage. Please, Nicholas.
Okay, that's great. So I want to start by thanking Dr. Kittipon. I always look forward about this time of year with some trepidation. Is Dr. Kittipon going to invite me to come back again this year? And so far he always has. And I'm really happy because he and I share a common passion, and it's the one that he just told you, which is that, like, law is too important, the rule of law is too important to be left to lawyers. And I actually have kind of been a little frustrated all my life with the way that lawyers think they are too important, right? And that non-lawyers are afraid of the law and think, oh, this is a matter left for lawyers. And I really hope to deliver on the on what Dr. Kittipon asked for, that we actually show you over the next half an hour why the rule of law matters to everybody. Because actually the role of the rule of law in actually promoting the things that we hold dear, a sustainable development for the sustainability and the future of our countries, actually law plays an incredibly important role together with, as part of an ecosystem in which you all contribute. And the other reason why I'm always excited to be invited to this program is not just because I really believe in this core idea, which I'm really happy for us to put right at the center when we start talking to you, but because of the way that it is really put into practice by the fantastic group that Dr. Kittipon brings together. And I was really reflecting, looking at all of your CVs, which he looked at in detail, but I also really looked through, and I was really, really impressed at the talent we have here too. It's an amazing tribute to Dr. Kittipon that we get people of your caliber applying for this program. And I really thought at some stage I should say to Dr. Kittipon, you can't keep calling this the workshop for emerging leaders, because these guys have already emerged. Sorry, but you guys have already made it. So, you know, I mean, but then I thought to myself, actually, no. We are all emerging leaders. Dr. Kittipon is still an emerging leader, you know, in this sense, that we all have to keep learning all our life long. One of the things that really struck me when I looked at the program this year, and when I looked at your backgrounds, I was like, this is really extraordinary, because we in UNDP, and I'm going to come back to this in a minute, we are placing an enormous emphasis right now on work around, on understanding the implications of technology, understanding the implications of AI and machine learning, both opportunities and threats for our work. And then I look at the, you know, your CV. I just not noticed this before. This is how quickly the world is changing. The profile of you, you know, the profile, the issues that you're discussing over the next 6 days are already year, which was already quite different from the one before that. And that's a challenge for people like Dr. Kittipon and I and Mads, who, you know, didn't know a lot about machine learning and AI a few years ago. I know that Dr. Kittipon is now very expert on all of these things. But safe to say, a few years ago, you know, these were not things that we were taught about in law school, right? So I want to say, first of all, I have a confession. I am an ex-lawyer. But don't hold it against me. Actually, I don't really call myself a lawyer anymore, because I stopped practicing law when I joined the UN. That's more than 17 years ago now. And I would now call myself a development practitioner. I have the particular role to try to fire people up around, make people understand, and get people engaged in and involved in making the rule of law do its work for sustainable development. And some legal knowledge is useful for that, but I have to know a lot about a lot of other things too, and now I am a student too, as I try to understand, and we all try to understand, how technology is going to change our environment. So with that, as excited as I am about the diversity of this group, and I really am excited about it, it also has the challenge that you all have very different backgrounds, and there is a great risk that everything I'm going to say is going to be far too basic for some of you who's going to be like, yeah, we know that stuff already. And some of you are going to be like, stop, that's too fast. Can we go back to that bit? I'm sorry about that. That's what Q&A is for. But I'm going to try and stay somewhere in the middle. I guess the thing is, this is just a taster, right? I want to give you just a few thoughts about how we can make this claim that rule of law is really at the heart of sustainable development, and plant some ideas or some basic, you know, some basic principles that you can reflect on when you get deep into the heart of this for the next 6 days. Now let's see if this works. It does. So here they are. So you may not be all equally familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. So let me just, this is the very quick learner on this. I know that you've got a very big, very heavy book of policy documents to read. So I know that you've read the SDGs. I could now point to one of you and say, target 1113, and you would tell me what it is. But I'm not going to do that. But you've probably managed to pick up this much, that every country in the world in 2015 signed up to change the world, to deliver a different world by 2030, right? A different world based on the principles of sustainable development, where all these 17 goals, which cover every aspect of human development, from poverty to inequality, hunger, climate change, biodiversity, it's all there. And to deliver this for everyone by 2030. It's a bold promise. It's already 2019. The world did change a lot since 2015, not always for the better. We have 11 years left. Still, it's enormously ambitious, but it does set us a very, very clear pathway. And some of you will know that before the SDGs, we had the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. And during the period of the MDGs, no one was asking me to deliver lectures on rule of law in the MDGs. And it's a great shame, because obviously the rule of law didn't suddenly become recently relevant for sustainable development. Everything that I'm going to say today has always been true. But when the UN launched the Millennium Goals in 2000, governments didn't want to accept, they didn't want publicly to admit that they had to have rule of law and good governance in order to achieve growth, in order to achieve development, sustainable development. It was a 15-year struggle to put that on the agenda. It was a great victory. It was a great advance that the world accepted that. So the MDGs were a first step. There were a number of discrete targets. Only governments had to fulfill them, and they didn't say anything about rule of law or governance. So people like me didn't work very much on the MDGs, even though our work was critical for them too. And the other thing is that the MDGs was very much a, target-based, reduced by 50%, double, improved by X amount. This agenda is so much more ambitious because it has to be achieved for everybody. Now, of course, some people might say that it's an unrealistic ambition. But the great thing is, for people like me, that the focus in the new agenda is you have to start by looking who is being left behind most. So if we say that there should be, a decent education for all, who are the people who are getting least education in your country now? And why is it? Is it because they are so remote and you haven't actually delivered you haven't delivered accessible schooling for people in remote communities? Is it that women are not being encouraged or facilitated to go to school so that their attendance rates or dropout rates are greater, or because they are made to enter the workforce, to go back to their families and work younger, so they are dropping out of school earlier? Is it that people with disabilities are not getting inclusive education, so that people with disabilities are not getting educated? And that's true everywhere. That's true everywhere, every country of the world. So you have to focus on who is missing out on these goals. And you're meant to actually work hardest in bringing them to the same level as everybody else. So equality is absolutely at the heart of all this. And that's why I like the fact that we don't have targets in these goals. Because the last targets, for example, said reduce poverty by half. A lot of countries did that. It looks very impressive. It is very impressive. It is a great achievement to have halved poverty in your country. But guess what? The half whose poverty was not reduced are the half who are hardest to face. Look at the half whose poverty didn't go down, and guess what? People with disabilities, almost all of them are in that half. Hardly any of their poverty got reduced. Migrant workers, well, their poverty still remained just as high. Women, poverty didn't go down as much as it did for men. So what we found is that by having a target of half, the government's focused on achieving the target. It's great, it's important, but it actually went along with increased inequality, because the people who were being left behind got left behind more. And that's one of the great problems we face in our world today. And that's why the ambition for the Sustainable Development Goals is to be achieved for all. I have a feeling that some weird commentary on my text in a language I don't understand is coming from on high. We have to achieve them for all, starting with the furthest behind first. And another point, which is really relevant to all of you, and to the points Dr. Kittipon made earlier, whereas before it was a governmental thing, many of you probably didn't even hear about the MDGs. It wasn't your business. Only governments had to achieve it. Only governments reported on it. The SDGs are for all of us. They are for governments, of course. They are all for civil society and NGOs. They're for the private sector too. Very happy that so. And as Dr. Kittipon said, this time round, because it's a comprehensive agenda, rule of law is right there. Target 16.3, the third target in Goal 16 about peaceful and just societies, promote the rule of law at national and international levels, ensure equal access to justice for all. Is it me? Am I doing this? Okay. What does rule of law mean? Dr. Kittipon said, please don't waste too much time worrying about definitions of rule of law. We don't have to waste time. The UN has already defined rule of law for you. The Secretary General gave a definition in 2004. At least for me, I don't have to worry about the definition. My Supreme Leader has already said it, and it's a great definition. And it's a very important definition for us. It's got quite a lot in it, right? There's a lot there. You can go and sort of see it later. But I wanted to stress this because it's really important to understand the breadth of the rule of law as a concept, to understand why it is important for the SDGs. Because, you know, when Dr. Kittipon talked about this debate about the rule of law, he's talking about a debate people say, the thin rule of law. Actually, I'm now a thinner version of the rule of law than I used to be. And the thick rule of law, which is what I used to be. You can look at the photograph of me in the program. You can see I used to be the thick rule of law. I've become the thin rule of law. But actually, I still stick up to the thick rule of law. Because the thin rule of law is like, look, rule of law just means having laws, making sure that the government only acts by the law, that laws are published. That's already a great thing. It doesn't really matter what the laws say. But I mean, what's the point if you're in a system of apartheid, if you're in a system where the laws are inherently discriminatory, or give benefits to some and not the others, or give more benefits to the rich than the poor? What's the value of applying those laws equally to everybody? They're inherently unequal. I mean, so the rule of law has no value. The idea of laws being public and the government following them and being accountable only has value when those laws themselves actually express a principle of equality inside them. So our principle of rule of law is a thick one, which means that the laws themselves have to, in fact, embody human rights standards, embody equality, and so that our rule of law of government, of private sector, of citizens to the law, and it's about the substantive content about them too. So you can see, when you look at this list of things, it's a very wide principle of governance. It's about participation, it's about accountability, it's about transparency, and that to why it applies in so many ways across the whole of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And I'm going to basically point out 4 areas that I want you to reflect on over the next six days. 4 different ways in which rule of law is at the heart of the agenda. And the first is this element of the human rights-based agenda. Because if rule of law is about laws fulfilling basic human rights principles and norms, this is a human right. First of the pretty much every human right is there, right? Certainly all of the economic and social and cultural rights, whether you're talking about right of education, right to food, whatever you're talking, gender equality, they're all there. So this is an agenda which actually, to achieve the agenda, you actually, in fact, have to achieve the core human rights norms, civil, political, social, economic. And you have to do it in a way, you have to do it for everybody equally. That's a great instance of the fundamental principle of equality and non-discrimination, because the great principle behind all human rights is having a right is a beautiful thing on a declaration on the wall if you can't actually go somewhere and have someone make the right real. So for every right there has to be a remedy. That's all about access to justice. So rule of law comes in there too. So that's the first aspect. And I mean, I don't want to spend time on this, but here's just a list of some of the different targets, you know, which are about transparency, participation, inclusion, accountability, access to information, fundamental rights, non-discrimination, access to justice. I mean, I'm just showing you these rule of law principles that you saw a few slides back in the Secretary General's, they're all over these targets. Okay, but you have the big fat book, and anyway, you memorized all these already, so I don't need to tell you this. So this is far too small for you to be able to see from here. This was just an example of how the result of this is that when you are trying to address any problem in the SDGs, any sustainable development issue, law is kind of all over it. Rule of law is all over it. And I was just giving an example about how you address gender-based violence. Okay, so you probably can't see this slide very well. But basically, I just mapped out here a number of the drivers of gender-based violence. Now this is, and again, this is an important point about law and non-law. So the drivers of gender-based violence are very different, right? And so you here have, so these different boxes represent different things that evidence shows all play a role in either fighting against or facilitating a culture of gender-based violence. So gender-based violence thrives when there is a weak justice system, right? We know that, and that's all, and you can understand that. When women have no effective access to, you know, so when there's impunity because there's no effective response to rape and domestic violence, obviously that's a driver. Discriminatory laws, right? Lack of political participation and inclusion, when women don't actually aren't seen as equal players in the political communities where they live. Again, this is just the evidence. I mean, the evidence shows that all these things go together. Discriminatory norms and practices, cultural norms where women are less equal, prevalence of community violence, conflict, lack of jobs and livelihood, exclusion from land. Actually, epidemiologic studies in the UK show that access to land is the single most important variable, together with customary norms and practices. The two things which go most strongly correlated with gender-based violence are access to land, rights for women, and cultural norms and practices. So these are the targets, right? These are the drivers of GBV, of gender-based violence, and you can see how rule of law is part of the solution. Obviously, rule of law is part of the solution on the weak justice system, right? But equally, discriminatory laws, that's part of the rule of law to ensure that you have a legal system without discriminatory laws. The political participation and inclusion, you said, part of our rule of law is a governance system with strong participation and inclusion. Jobs and livelihoods, community violence, conflicts. I don't need to go through it. Just to show you that all of these different drivers, some of them social, some of them around, you know, goods like employment, some of them very much around the justice system, rule of law is key to all of them. So the response has to coordinate across all of these things. So the second dimension of rule of law in the agenda is about kind of justice and peace. So obviously, I mean, you'll all already have thought, quite obviously, the criminal justice system is there to reduce violence. Obviously, you need an effective legal system to be able to protect people from violence. So that's obviously one very clear sense in which the rule of law is key to the peace and non-violence aspects of social development, of sustainable development. But not just those. I also want to raise the point that, again, one of the great drivers of a peaceful society is a society that is based on, you know, a social contract, a society in which people feel that there is basic justice, in which inequalities haven't got, inequalities are kept within a reasonable level. This sense of being part of a reasonable community with a degree of trust, of social cohesion, this is also really key. And so the things which rule of law provides, equality, justice, accountability, are also key to promoting peaceful societies. So it goes beyond the criminal law. And of course, where you are recovering from conflict, transitional justice, accountability for the abuses of the past is really important too. The third one, which again is very clear and obvious, there are many targets all the way through the SDGs around fighting financial crime, corruption, organized crime, transnational crime. Quite obviously, these are incredibly important drivers, very difficult drivers, which are impeding our progress to the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to prioritize fighting these. But I also wanted to particularly talk about the role of the private sector, because you are a very diverse group. You have a lot of people from the private sector, and we need to particularly emphasize the partnership with the private sector and NGOs for sustainable development. And the reason why is obvious. I mean, Asia is a great, of course, this is true worldwide, but we're in Asia, so let me focus on the fact that Asia is, of course, a fantastically dynamic part of the world, and it's dynamic because of the fantastic energy and dynamism of the private sector. And the private sector and private sector delivered growth and investment are the key, are the drivers of growth in Asia. But is that growth going to be inclusive? Is that growth going to be equitable? Is that growth going to come with greater equality, or is it going to continue the backwards trend of greater inequality we've been seeing ever since the Millennium Goals were launched? That is the key question. So the question is private sector activity, is it contributing to sustainable development as economic growth? And to answer that key question, again, everybody has a role. And we in the UN, we live by a set of things called the guiding principles on business and human rights. And those guiding principles, they have 3 pillars. And the first pillar is called protect. And that says to governments, you have to create a level playing field under which your domestic laws require businesses to respect human rights. Otherwise, you're going to create a situation in which good, responsible business, which takes care, which looks at its supply chains, looks at its value chains, makes sure that there is no exploitation, no discrimination, no gender inequality, going on amongst anywhere in its supply chain. Good businesses will be penalized because bad businesses are able to carry on in your country and actually, profit from exploitation, profit from human rights abuses, and there'll be no accountability and there'll be impunity because your laws can't be used against them, and the good businesses will lose out. So you must create an equal playing field so that every business that does business in your country has to obey human rights principles. So that's the first thing. We turn to governments and we say, pass those laws. So we work with Thailand. Thailand is a leader in this region on business and human rights. We work in Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia and many countries around Asia to get the governments to put that framework in place. But the second pillar is about business itself. We need to partner with business. Business needs to show responsible leadership, show the way, develop and share the best practices which really help businesses be able to clearly see how their work impacts on sustainable development. Is it reaching people with disabilities equally, right? Or not? Is it impacting men and women equally? Is it impacting indigenous people more than others? And to make sure that the business is actually playing a positive role and not a negative role in sustainable development. That's the second pillar. And the third is remedy, because there is no point to rhymes without remedies. And actually, business community has a great role in this. So where there are projects, for example, there are already many very good extractive projects which have good grievance mechanisms. Because, it's kind of unrealistic for herders in Mongolia, working near a copper mine in the Gobi Desert. It's hard for them to go to court, right? Hard for them to take their case to court. So if people living in the Gobi Desert are going to want redress, they need an effective grievance mechanism to take their issue with the project and have it resolved equitably for everybody. So company grievance mechanisms are a key example of remedies. So that's very important for us too. So I'm going to close, not a moment too soon, by some of the challenges we're facing, which I would like you all to be thinking about over the next 6 days. I mean, first of all, it's about innovation. So there's a recent piece of research from Hill, that's the Hague Institute for Innovation and Law. And that says, basically, they did a survey, they did research with 70,000 people, so it's a very serious piece of research. What they found out is 1 in 8 people in the world face some kind of a legal problem every year. A problem with their neighbors, a problem with their family, a problem with work, some kind of basically a legal problem, even if they don't call it a legal problem. Not saying that they take it to court, they mostly don't. They face a problem with real impact in their lives, 1 in 8 every year. So in a country like Thailand, with 60 million people, it's got to face something like 7.5 million problems happening every year that the country should be helping people to solve. Compare that with the actual level of court cases, I mean, it's nowhere. So most of these cases are being solved informally, and the research showed that only 1/3 of them are being solved satisfactorily in time. Only 1/3 of people said their problem got solved in the way it needed to, in the time it needed to. So we have huge unmet legal needs, and these huge unmet legal needs will not be remedied by the court system. That's not the fault of the court system. It's not about far more courts. The court system is always going to be too remote. There are never going to be enough lawyers. Lawyers are always going to be too expensive. We have to find other solutions, solutions involving mediations, flexible solutions involving technology to bring real justice closer to people. And that kind of innovation and new thinking, everyone, especially those of you working on innovation, need to play a part. So technology is really important in all of this. I was just in the Maldives. It's a country of 300,000 people, spread out over an incredibly large number of islands, but with great connectedness. So even if you're on a remote island in the Maldives, you can access the internet, but you've not got a court anywhere near you. So we have to use technology to be able to bring justice closer to the people. We need a data revolution because we just simply don't know enough about what works. We don't know enough about what countries are spending on justice. We don't know enough about the impact it's having. Unless we have good data, we'll never make good policy. But we need a cultural revolution. Because, what makes countries like Singapore and Hong Kong, for example, have much lower issues around corruption than some other countries is partly cultural. Some countries in Asia have developed it much more than others. What do we do to develop this culture of lawfulness where everybody, the private sector, government officials, understand and feel empowered to make all their decisions in accordance with the law? And how do we the relationship between the private sector and NGOs hasn't always been great. When I talk to NGOs, they're like, we don't want to work with the private sector. We're there for the public good. They're only there for profit. So look, we need to actually get together and begin to unpack some of our misunderstandings, right? It's really important that we're all in this together. We have a long way to go. So those are some of the challenges which I want you to solve for me over the next 6 days. So we in UNDP, for example, are very much focusing on some of these challenges. We have a business and human rights program where we are working with business and NGOs and the government to fulfill those 3 pillars all over Asia. We have a program called Promoting a Fair Business Environment in ASEAN. So here in Thailand, for example, it works on transparent corruption. So we have not only helped the government of Thailand put into force very good standards of transparency in public procurement, but we're working with business and civil society to be watchdogs on public procurement in Thailand. And so we're doing this in a number of countries too. So we're working with the private sector and lots of other things. I don't have time to tell you about them all now, but I'm telling you about them all now because, please get involved. Whether you're working for a government, in a justice agency or in any other kind of agency, if you're working in the private sector on AI and innovation, and you think that some of your work could be interesting to us. By the way, we're always very happy to have pro bono partnership with the private sector. Some great private sector companies have, for example, contributed their thinking to help us design prototypes around access to justice using apps, using different new technologies. So we're very, very happy to discuss those partnerships. If you're interested in taking part in any of our programs, some of you already do. So some of you represent companies which are already part of our initiative. So some of you already are working with us. But if you're not, there's my email, there's my WhatsApp, and there's my Twitter. Get in touch, and let's see whether you can join with us as we go together to make the Sustainable Development Goals real. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Mr. Nicholas Booth. Now I'd like to please invite Dr. Kittipong to present a token of appreciation to Mr. Nicholas Booth on behalf of TIJ. For the next session on asking better policy questions, I'd like to please welcome Dr. Osama Siddiq, Executive Director of the Law and Policy Research Network and Senior Faculty at the IGLP, to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. After sort of warning you about the bane of engaging with lawyers, this is the third lawyer in a row that you'll be facing. So I can quite sympathize with your situation. Dr. Kittipong, the wonderful, incredibly hospitable TIJ team, I'd like to thank you once again for giving me the opportunity, and of course, having this joint workshop with IGLP. I must confess this is the third year, and there's so much which I see which is going forward in terms of collective approaches to understanding issues and coming up with new frameworks for looking at them. Pedagogical innovation, already this year, the workshop is doing something new, which is quite interesting in terms of the sort of the problem labs and the problem questions with which experts will be engaging. So I have a slightly different purpose. We've had two very sort of rich conversations and talks which have been directed at you. I'm essentially trying to do two things here. First of all, I'm here to introduce you to who we are, the Institute for Global Law and Policy. Incredibly difficult for me to actually encapsulate in a few words a group which is so eclectic, but still there is a commonality of approach, there's a commonality of methodology, which brings us together. And it's also the second purpose of why I'm here is to briefly introduce you to some of the things which we'll be doing together over the course of the next, what in my experience have been some of the emerging sort of interesting themes when it comes to policy analysis or the factors which have become more important. Obviously, we live in a dynamic world and things keep changing, but these are some sort of lenses which may be helpful in terms of going forward. Okay. So I'm going to start with some essential assumptions, preoccupations, and approaches which define IGLP or IGLP. The people who are usually engaged with the policy discourse, with coming up with policy solutions are, of course, national governments, but also policy institutes, think tanks, international development corporations, IFIs, public policy schools at universities. So we are none of the above. We are essentially a bunch of academics. We are all scholars. Most of us are full-time faculty members at one university or the other, and the others who work on the cusp of law and policy, like myself, still engage with scholarship, but we work closely with governments on policy reform issues. So what we bring to the table is something quite unique, because we bring to the table the rigor of the academy. We are not a McKinsey, which is not to take anything away from them, but we are people who are into long-term research, into empiricism, into theory, into deconstructing things, being critical. And at the same time, we also are not, hopefully, ivory tower sort of academia, but people who are constantly and regularly engaged with policy questions. The other interesting thing about the IGLIP faculty group is that these are not just lawyers. A lot of the people here are actually very multidisciplinary, not only in terms of their approach, but also in terms of expertise in related disciplines like economics, sociology, anthropology. So that also makes it a fairly interesting group of people looking at policy questions. The other, I guess, commonality is that we're all, or at least we try to be, incredibly critical. Nothing is sacred for us. There is no dogma of the doctrine which sort of pins us down. Whether we do international law, whether we do criminal justice, whether we do any other area of law, we are very happy and very keen and indeed very driven to sort of deconstruct these issues, to look at them in their context and try and figure out what's going on. So in that sense, we are incredibly different from a more black letter law approach. We actually consider law not just to be the black letter, but also the institutional structure, the assumptions behind it, the socio-economic political system which a legal system tries to establish. I guess inherent to that approach is the fact that we find that law can be incredibly indeterminate. Now, this is in no way meant to be, and this struck me last year as well, this is in no way contradictory to what has just been said, to what Mr. Booth spoke about, or Dr. Kittipong. The United Nations goals, the UNDP goals, various other international treaties and aspirations are incredibly important in our context and indeed in other contexts. And there is an element of the law which lends itself to great precision, or there are multiple kinds of consensus on what ought to be achieved. But generically speaking, and this will come through very clearly when we engage with you and learn from you and try and impart whatever we have learned in the policy groups, as you analyze your policy questions, that law is not necessarily always determinate or precise. It can lend itself to multiple meanings. It may have come into being at a particular point in time because of particular compulsions or considerations, but frankly, it can also lead to other intended or unintended consequences. And so we look at that and we try and look at what those ambiguities or uncertainties and indeed even opportunities are which a text of law presents. So I guess the binary of law in books and law in practice, and I'm sure many of you may have heard it before, is something which is incredibly important. Many of us also look at law sociologically. It's not just the right which is vested in a statute which is important. It is also the ability of a victim to be able to get that right. And what becomes then important is various kinds of access to justice issues. Who has access to a lawyer? What happens in a courtroom? What are the economic disparities which have an impact on your capacity or your ability to seek justice? That's just one example. But you will find, if you do work in the field, and not just textual analysis of judgments and statutes, which we don't do. As I said, we look at a lot of these other factors as well. It becomes incredibly important to look at the overall sort of milieu. And that is something which we also try and impart when we talk about policy, when we talk about the policy-making process, when we talk about the connection between law and policy. I think it's also important, there's a lot of valorization of the law, and where I come from, which is in Pakistan, there's this post-colonial language which is used as well, the majesty of the law. Now, I have deep and remarkable respect for the law, but I think it's also important to recognize where law becomes an instrument of coercion. You can have bad laws, you can have unethical laws, you can have unjust laws. So I think it's important to have that radar always working in terms of what a particular law is trying to achieve. And so the ethics of policy making and lawmaking are also quite important. So I guess one of the fundamental questions, and frankly I'll be sharing with you a whole bunch of questions, and I promise you I'm not going to be answering any of them, which is very convenient. But I think since the entire purpose of this exercise, which we are going to do together, is also to ask better questions, I think it's important to introduce you to the menu of ideas and queries which we should be thinking about over the next 4 to 5 days. There is this fundamental question about the distinction between law and policy. This is something which we'll be looking at. And what is the legal regime and what is the political regime? And what are points of convergence, conformism, or what are points of dissent, disagreement, confrontation? Where do they run parallel? How do they part ways? What happens? And is it really useful to think about them as incredibly mutually exclusive binaries with airtight boundaries, or are they areas which are much more complex with a lot of overlap? One of the things which will also come through is that if you adopt a very sort of staunch legalistic approach, one of the things which I've noticed last time, and I've had an experience of dealing with a lot of context, is that people think that if you rule changing, rule amendment is not always easy. Sometimes there are more obvious, more immediate, more doable alternatives. And sometimes even the rule the things which you need to be mindful of haven't been looked at. So one very sort of common thing which happens in my context in India and Bangladesh is wherever there is a situation, you have a first information report to the police, and you always think of a dispute in terms of a trial. Now, that is not how it works. There are multiple incentives, multiple ways to regulate behavior. So I think it's important for us to also proceed in a manner when we look at policy questions. Is rulemaking, is litigation, are these the most optimal solutions? Secondly, the other sort of big assumption in a lot of policy arenas is that reform has failed simply because of poor implementation. I think implementation is important, but I think it's overemphasized. Quite often, the design of the reform itself is deeply flawed because it's not been thought through, it's not been questioned sufficiently. And there are a whole host of reasons as to why the design factor gets neglected. I'll hint at some of them towards the end of my presentation. So one of the fundamental things which we will try and do is how do you frame a question? How do you ask a policy question? It's not rocket science, but it still takes a fair amount of practice. It takes, the ability to look at multiple factors which may have an impact on that policy intervention. It can happen that what may be the most obvious question to ask is the wrong question to ask, and it will just send you on a trajectory which is not a win-win situation. It may be that you are missing out on some key stakeholders. It may be that you are missing out on some key details as far as the regulatory or the legal environment is concerned. Maybe you're oblivious to a cultural dimension. So I think it becomes incredibly important that the question is framed properly and that we ask better questions, because better questions lead to better solutions. Now, I'm obviously just making a particular question asked in a certain way will take us in a different direction from a different question, and whether they are, whether they compare to each other or whether one is superior to the other. So that requires, and that is what we do, a multi-lens, a multi-level analytical approach. As I said at the very start, ours is not a very sort of limited, formalistic legal approach. We try and look at things from multiple lenses, from the lens of culture, sociology, regulation, and that sort of hopefully then takes us to a more sort of multi-level approach. And that's where the multiple disciplines in which various members of the faculty have a background in comes to the rescue. Now, two of the most important things I've seen in terms of justice sector reform in my context and other similar contexts, and that is pretty true here, is that a lot of policy analysis is very ahistorical. In other words, it is devoid of engagement with history. It doesn't look at history. Whereas, oftentimes it's incredibly important to look at history if you're not going to repeat the same mistakes. Now, those sound like fairly, standard words, but, one can quote multiple examples where that has been the issue. And the other big issue is the decontextualization of the policy discourse. And I'll talk a bit more about that, but I think context really matters. You have to look at the context and you have to tailor your solution accordingly. You can't have a standard solution for every single context. So the task over the next 5 days is that we are going to introduce and embrace, for the purpose of this entire exercise, certain frameworks which we will bring to the table. And on the other hand, I've had the privilege this year, but in the last couple of years, it's an incredibly rich and challenging and provocative set of pieces which you bring to the table, which are not only interesting because they have an individual mark on them of your own particular perception of a policy question, but also because they very well encapsulate the kind of standard and fairly troubling policy questions which are confronted by a lot of people. So I think we have a very good spectrum, and it should be incredibly exciting. Okay, so the idea here is that, as I said earlier, that we need to demystify things. You know, there are certain standard notions about law and policy, and so one of the things which we'll be trying to do, as I said earlier, is to make a distinction between law, policy, politics. How do they overlap? How do they add or subtract from each other? There is also this notion that politics is dirty. Politics is to be avoided. Politics is denigrating. It is something which is beneath you. Whereas policy is something sanitized, incredibly precise, perfectly kosher, perfectly legitimate terrain, language, modus, for various people in society to try and get what they aspire to or what they think they deserve, for various kinds of social collaborations and compromises. Politicization of an institution, I think you will particularly relate to this because, like myself, there are lots of contexts which have, the idea of democratic continuity has a lot of resonance there. So sustainable development, all these goals are incredibly important, but part and parcel of that is also civil liberties, rights, democracy, and you can't have any of those things without politics. So I think one of the important distinctions which we'll try and make is that it's not this very simplistic notion of policy being superior and sanitized and expert and politics being a problem. And then what is the role of policy when it comes to the law? Is it something which is rational, quantifiable, scientific? Should it be? Or is it also messy? And that's okay, as long as you aspire to and you reach certain optimal outcomes. So what ought to be the process, and what are the characteristics, and what are the prices which we have to pay? I think it's important to get over some standard notions of how these spheres work and to embrace the complexity of these spheres in order to sort of proceed in a more harmonious fashion. Also, our policy discourse is normatively indeterminate. In other words, is there something which policy is trying to achieve which is not linked to any social norms, to any social aspirations? We don't think so. I think it's not something which is, normative. Now, equally important is who makes the policy decisions. And when you discuss your policy questions with us, this question will come up time and again. Who has the power to make these policies? Who are the stakeholders? Who's the disempowered one? Who is not being listened to? And is that something which is necessarily important, or it isn't? And I'm not saying it in a sort of emotive manner here. I'm also talking about it from a pragmatic fashion, because the people you ignore and the people you overlook may well turn out to be the people who undo the entire policy initiative. Are there good and bad policy questions? As I said, this is something which we're going to try and do. Now, the other big thing is, and whether we talk about the UN goals and a lot of other things, sometimes there can be a contestation between international or global norms and local aspirations and local norms. How do you strike a balance? Is global always to supersede? Or is the local always to be justified because it is local? I mean, these questions will come up time and again. And should abstract universal goals even determine policy at the cost of non-neutral local factors? I mean, we don't take it as a given. I think it's a question which needs to be debated, and it may vary from situation to situation. But when you look at actual practical situations which bureaucrats, CEOs, and other people face, they may have very, very legitimate imperatives to do a certain thing, but they may be constrained by something else. One of the really sort of key insights from last time was when some of the participants discussed in detail how they thought that certain policies were more beneficial for Thailand, but they also felt that the expectation from them was to follow a certain different set of policies because of treaty obligations and all that. Now, I think that may not always be accurate, but there may be valid, legitimate situations where you are being pulled in different directions. And so then the question arises that should policy making really be sort of styled and circumscribed as something which is sanitized in order to avoid all these contestations, or does it have to respond to it and embrace it without being compromised? So is it an ideal thing which we pursue, or is it the desirable, the pragmatic, or merely the doable? One comes across a lot of people who are willing to compromise on what is the least common denominator. Should one be pushing for more? What is pragmatic in the policy sphere? I guess one of the most important links between policy and law is how law is used as an instrument of policy, and how it can be used effectively as an instrument of policy. But beware that law is not merely an instrument. Law is also a set of norms. Law is also a terrain of contestation. Law can also be coercive. So the connotation and the nuance will have to be understood. Another challenge is when you have competing normative frameworks in the same policy milieu, and this is particularly true for the global south, where there are multiple, at times, normative frameworks. Despite having constitutions, you may have local cultural norms, you may have religion, you may have other things. And so hence, in this complex milieu, the challenge is to try and ask good policy questions. Now, I'm slightly hesitant to share this with you, considering that we have a new pedagogical sort of element this time, where we have people who are experts, who are going to be doing questions, workshops on certain kinds of specialized questions with you. But I think it's important that from our perspective, there's a slight element of skepticism as well about the general concept of expertise. And I'll give you a specific example. This does not contradict what we're trying to do here. And that takes us to the larger question of what is knowledge, where does it come from, who does the knowledge production in a society, how is that knowledge used? But the question of who the experts are they international sort of experts who fly into a country and they have a particular kind of expertise? Are they a local privileged group with specialized access to information? I'll give you one very common example. The countries in which there's a lot of donor-funded justice sector reform, like mine, the actual people with an impact on reform is incredibly small. So there are some international experts, some local experts, some judges, a few top bureaucrats, maybe one or two key politicians. And that can create an issue. Because the impression which can be created is that policy reform, policy intervention is a highly technical exercise. And nobody other than lawyers or people with that kind of expertise can actually dabble in it. And the very fact that comparatively few people have access to that particular language, the language of law, for instance, can potentially disempower. Now, one of the important things Dr. Kittipong said at the very outset is that when it comes to policy thinking, policy interventions, you don't have to be a lawyer. All of you are stakeholders. All of you bring something incredibly important to the table. And all those perspectives matter when you're deconstructing policy questions and trying to answer them. So I think it's important also when we look at this policy milieu about the role of experts and expertise. Because in many ways, that will tell you which voices are being elevated and which perspectives have more primacy than others. One of the things which we will therefore do is to try and better identify all the stakeholders, constituents, allies, opponents, affectees, whenever we look at a policy question or a policy intervention. And the question which will emerge time and again is possibly the clash, excuse me, between the technocratic and the political. As I said, there is a certain sort of tendency to look at the technocratic as superior as compared to the political, because the former is precise and dispassionate and not swayed by parochialism, whereas politics is all things bad. But as I said, this is not a very accurate description, and this is not something to be adhered to. The reverse also is important, that there are certain areas where technical expertise does matter, and that where technical expertise can have an important bearing. I'll give you an example. Crime scene investigation ought to be the same all over the world. I mean, how you lift fingerprints should not be different in Tajikistan and Denmark, right? So there are areas of intervention where there is really no excuse about local constituents or local issues and things like that. On the other hand, how you resolve a dispute, how much leeway does a criminal justice system, for example, give to reaching a compromise between private parties, is a much more complex phenomenon. Because local norms, local approaches, local ways of resolving disputes is incredibly subjective at times. And much as you try and adhere to certain international norms, you see those variations. I guess also the ultimate goal is important. What are you trying to do through that policy? Is the aim an institution, institutional preservation, citizens as an abstract concept, a discrete group of citizens, the nation state, a particular ideology or economic system? So I think it becomes incredibly important to circumscribe your policy vision by thinking about what exactly are you trying to do. So one of the things which I've said is that the fact that an expert says that all these policy things, questions, are unintelligible to you because you're not the expert is something to be resisted, because expertise can turn into a false necessity. It doesn't always turn into a false necessity, but it can. And it can also be a way to sort of say that we are going to ignore the multiple competing interests in a society by trying to say, oh, I'm not favoring this group or that group. This is my expert opinion about the optimal solution. I mean, it's not like, even when you build a dam, which is a fairly technical thing, it has complex ramifications for the local ecology, for the local population, and there are multiple other examples. So I think we have to be wary whether it's being used as a cunning justification for a particular policy from amongst many possibilities. I mean, one of David Kennedy's really important insight in the context of international law is how law and the legal language has become very prominent in all these discourses over the years, and how at times it may be used to disguise the really important but seemingly irreconcilable economic and political contestations. And that's also very true in the domestic context. Now, two other things which I think permeate the thinking of a lot of people associated with IGLIP is that laws in many ways are not sacred. They are background rules which in many ways determine how business or ordinary life or crime management takes place in a society. So think about it. I mean, it's a particular kind of a political and economic compromise which leads to a legal regime. You can have a very different contract law, and that could be legitimate. You can have a very different inheritance law. It's about how do you place responsibilities and liabilities and access to assets in a particular society. So once you have that notion, you start looking beyond the law and beyond the policy at what exactly those underlying economic and political frameworks are, because ultimately a policy is advocating those frameworks and a law is preserving them. And the other important thing is that we can never assume that in any given system, everybody is playing on a level playing field. You may have a wonderful charter of rights, you may have a wonderful constitutional framework, but the fact that who has access to actualize those rights is going to depend on multiple factors, on gender, on education, on whether you're an urban or local dweller. I've done a fair amount of empirical work looking at litigants who come to the lowest courts in South Asia. And the quantum of difference in terms of their empowerment because of a lot of non-law factors is really palpable. So that point I've already made. And as I said, that expertise should not obfuscate the fact that there may be some very genuine controversies in society, and your policy intervention is actually meant to tackle those. Obviously, and this must be very familiar to you, when you do policy thinking and policy interventions, at times fairly parochial, selfish, self-centered kind of imperatives like turf management or strategic or political interests of various groups come in. So I think it's very important to look beyond the obvious. Even the obvious objection being made to a particular policy intervention may not necessarily readily reveal what the underlying imperatives are. So that's why the demystification, the clearance of the debris, trying to focus on what's actually happening becomes incredibly important. And because of a lot of these reasons, expert discourses can become open to manipulation. So I guess the upshot here really is that expertise matters, and especially as we get into a specialized age, there are knowledge production systems and people who are incredibly important. But at the same time, let it not become the hegemony of the experts. The policy discourse is ultimately about people, and all of you can bring in a perspective which is incredibly important. So I guess the idea here is to show whether policy making has any linkages with previous eras of hegemony, or is it something which is much more global in the sense that people have a lot more say. We have hyperlinks available, but I don't think there's a need to sort of take a look at them. But I'm sure all of you are incredibly familiar with these international rankings, right? You have ease of doing business, good governance, rule of law. So we are all being constantly gauged against each other, in the region, in the continent, globally, according to GDP, according to, access to justice. And it has some value in terms of both putting pressure on those who are lagging behind, but also in terms of looking at medium to long-term trends of progress. But I guess the question still arises that does this, I'm not saying it necessarily does, but I'm saying the question arises that does this sort of impede in any way the capacity of a particular jurisdiction to choose the priorities it wants to choose? A lot of justice sector reform programs advocate a strong contract enforcement, land regime protection kind of an ethos, whereas relatively few talk about environmental rights or labor rights. And sometimes what you choose can be contentious, because if you go in one particular direction, if you're producing, for example, a new legal regime which is heavily promoting mining, are you being mindful about the rights of the tribals and the people who get affected by that? So all those things ultimately are political and economic, but does any of this actually push you in a certain direction? So you have this term of best practices. For whom? For the country which is actually gaining? Yes, at times, but maybe not at times. Also, there's a tendency, if you look at policy interventions, to avoid deep, tough structural reforms. They take a lot more effort. They're very difficult to report on and monitor. There are too many political problems. And so I'm personally quite tired of this term, low-hanging fruit. Every time I get engaged in a new project, people are looking for the low-hanging fruit. And I tell them that the low-hanging fruit has long been consumed. The tree is denuded. There's nothing left. So let's just try and do something different. The other thing is also that, how much attention span, how much perseverance there is in terms of embedding policy reforms. Sometimes it's not just about the policy intervention, it's about hand-holding. It's about guiding a particular institution through fairly difficult terrain. And oftentimes, after the initial sort of announcement of a rule or the notification of a rule, not enough effort goes into embedding reform, because reform has as much to do with structure and language and rules as it also has to do with culture of an institution, right? And those things don't change over time. The question of globalism, cultural relativism, I'm sure you must have been, there's the entire Asian cultural relativism debate. These are factors which you have to be, and we all have to be mindful of. How does the global ethos permeate the globe now, and how do these factors still stand? This is a very integral, important debate in the international human rights literature as well. So balancing the global and the local becomes one of the challenges. The other thing which I mentioned earlier, and this is a particularly typical Orientalist notion of what India and Pakistan looks like. I love this kind of painting aesthetically, but it's always elephants and exotic-looking Asians. But context still matters. And in various ways, When we talk about these universal standards, and I'm talking in particular here about justice sector reform programs, which is what I do mostly, you get a lot of templates. So something has been tried in Sierra Leone, and so it should be tried in Pakistan. I'll give you an example. Apparently, introducing paralegals has been a huge success in Sierra Leone. And that's because it's a smaller population, relatively simpler disputes, and they don't have a very large body of lawyers, so there is a paucity of legal expertise. Does not mean that now you introduced paralegals in Pakistan, which is a country with hundreds of thousands of lawyers, most of whom are unemployed and need capacity building and are a ready cadre of people who can be employed to pursue the goals. If you bring in paralegals, there's going to be a huge fight over a small pie and a mini civil war amongst legal practitioners. Now, some of the most cynical people amongst you may think that that's actually a very desirable goal, because if you kill all the lawyers, things will improve. But on a more serious note, things may not necessarily work in a different context, just because they worked in a particular context. So what we call cookie cutter solutions and policy compliance box ticking, to assume that since the Inspector General of Police has approved a new draft of how police investigations should take place, will actually mean that police investigations take place like that. Those are the kind of naive assumptions which have at times plagued a lot of these interventions. And as I said, transplantation, which is really taking one idea and sort of putting it elsewhere without any contextual relevance. The other thing which makes at least international funded reform problematic at times, even though at times it's incredibly useful, is that it's not just the donor country. You may have what are called international development corporations. So increasingly what I see is that instead of, let's say, the Department of International Development of the United Kingdom government intervening and sort of collaborating and giving its expertise, now they have a bidding process. And this happens in a lot of other sectors, but it's happening much more now in law as well. And some international company, which will have a Rolodex of expertise, will come in. But here, at the end of the day, the imperative is profit. So what does that do? How does that make the entire sort of reform discourse and the policy intervention even more complex? Because it's not just whatever bilateral relationships between two countries are, or whatever the imperatives, noble or not so noble, of a particular government may be. You also have a third party. So what you see in terms of historical experience, in terms of policy interventions in the justice sector, are a lot of executive shortcuts and a democratic deficit. They don't like to talk to the politicians or the political players or other people who may at times really ask legitimate but very probing questions. They'd much rather deal with one judge or one particular senior bureaucrat, convince him or her, and try and push the thing through. Developing world, of course, also has a lot of path dependencies in terms of how these economies are structured, how these legal systems have been set up. There are multiple other factors like tradition, religion, culture, society, and politics. And there's, of course, colonialism, which has played a big part in a lot of countries in the South. And these are all factors which are incredibly important, but not often recognized or sort of taken as seriously as they should be. The other important sort of dimension of policy analysis in the current sort of sphere for some time now is the data. And you will often find in your own context when you do policy work that the anecdotal is very important. Just because someone is very senior, that particular person will claim access to all wisdom, and it will be very difficult to bring about any innovation. So one of the things which I discovered through personal experience is, how do you make incredibly domineering, incredibly opinionated, and incredibly senior people pause and listen to you? You bring out the data, which is not always easy, but it's incredibly difficult also to question it, right? Because the picture becomes very clear. So I think the use of data to inform policy and even sort of lawmaking is incredibly important. Data can be a tool, it can be a weapon, but let's also be very, very clear that there are limits to quantitative approaches. I think, if you look at the administration of a justice system, like a case flow management system, increasingly you can't do anything without the data. But you can't quantify what is justice. So for example, you can't say that a criminal justice system is incredibly good because it has a high rate of convictions. It's much more complex than that. A criminal justice system is not just about the outcome, And a just outcome could be an acquittal or a compromise rather than a conviction. It's also about the process. It's about whether people felt that they got their say in that process, whether all the evidence was collected, multiple other things. So I think it's important to be mindful of the value of the qualitative while also using the quantitative to its potential. Increasingly, in policy interventions and reform projects, the measurement of outcomes is becoming very important, the M&E sort of dimension to it. So I think it's also important to visualize these questions in a manner that it takes care of that. And it's important not, as I said, to just do cosmetic changes, but to think about reform as institutional structure, culture, transparency, accountability, incentives. These are often areas which are comparatively neglected. Okay, so moving on towards the end, comparativism is another thing which we will be trying to pursue here, and the value of this entire structure is tremendously invigorating how not only did we have remarkable debates between people with a particular professional sort of background with others, so the police people talking to the prosecutors, but also Vietnam talking to Thailand, talking to Sri Lanka, in terms of what worked in terms of police reform. So I think one of the things which we need to be mindful going forward is that much as there are a lot of interesting Western models which have value, what does regional comparativism mean? There is comparatively little regional assessment of what's happening. I mean, I can tell from my context that my policymakers know relatively little about what's happening in Thailand, and at least I have always tried to persuade them to look east when it makes sense. State, the South has pluralistic traditions. I've mentioned colonialism. We've also, various countries have had the experience of the police or the autocratic state. So there's a lot of information sharing which needs to take place because of this paucity of regional assessments. So I would like to end here and once again sort of say three things. You will get, and I think the next step is for us to share with you these two sort of very short, concise documents. One is on making a policy presentation. The other is on through which we'll go through our policy groups, and we'll talk a bit more about that. My idea here was to sort of give you an initial sort of flavor, a glimpse of how we try and critically examine things, and also to perhaps highlight and underline some of the major sort of developments when it comes to policy assessment and policy discourse. And I look forward to engaging with all of you. Thank you.